So up next, we have the CEO and co-founder from DeSci Labs, Christopher Hill, speaking about open verifiability.
Oh, awesome. Chris is the best.
Yeah. Towards a more reproducible scientific record, which returns value to the scientific community, is kind of what Adam was just talking about. So Chris, great to have you. Just a little background on Chris here. Chris is a co-founder of DeSci Labs and an interdisciplinary scientist who's worked at the crossroads of neuroscience, economics, and machine learning. He has a PhD in neuroeconomics and a couple of cool papers published in big journals. So Chris, great to have you here.
Hey, great to be here. Yeah, super excited. Thanks a lot for organizing all of this, Patrick. We've had some really great speakers up to now. So today I'm going to talk about open verifiability and how this could promote a more reproducible scientific record, which returns value to scientists. So the first thing I want to frame out is the broader problem beyond funding of science, beyond the questions of prestige in academia, but really go towards the threat that our epistemic commons, our information sphere, is facing at the moment. They're under threat. Trusted intermediaries used to play a critical role, and still do today to some degree, in curating research and knowledge. And you'd have that process typically be handled by a journal who would, conduct peer review over multiple months at the behest of the authors. Then that curation process would trickle up to the press, to journalists who would report about it. For example, in New York Times, it would then go up, to policymakers who, for example, people working at the Federal Reserves or others there. So that's our information supply chain, essentially. And it's not foolproof, right? There's been some spectacular failures of that information supply chains over the years. And, we have, for example, right now, the unraveling of the Alzheimer house of cards with the beta-amyloid hypothesis and other key papers that have been found, to contain image fabrication and other signs of fraud, which are calling into question, whole edifices of science. And these are, hundreds of millions of dollars that have been invested into that. This trusted intermediary model has suffered from two major systemic failures. The first one, and the most important one, is the replication crisis. There's a raging replication crisis out there. Papers simply don't replicate. John Ioannidis, wrote a famous paper, Why Most Research Findings Are False. And there's essentially a lot of work to be done to improve the reproducibility of research in general. And the other major issue is that the publishing industry has consolidated in a few publishers who have a monopoly on knowledge, and exploit that monopoly with libraries and other funders, and exploit scientists to work for free, to essentially become, content creators for Elsevier. Nobody wants that anymore. So there's a rebellion that's brewing in academia. You can see this on Twitter. You can see this as a journal editor, where it's getting harder and harder to find qualified peer reviewers because people are simply fed up with a lot of the system in its current incarnation. And so what's the alternative? So there's a void. And the void that's happening right now is that there's a direct model that's becoming more and more common. Essentially, it goes from preprint platforms directly to social media, directly to a journalist who's interested in generating clicks over sharing valid knowledge. And this is a threat to our epistemic commons. You have you have spectacular cases, for example, the HIV gene insertion in that COVID preprint, right, which has been debunked, but the damage has been done. And there's still a lot of people out there believing that COVID has HIV inserts into its virus. So these information hazards tend to live in conspiracy silos, but as governments and institutions are losing trust, these conspiracy silos are growing, and there's more and more people that are being radicalized to believe things that conform to pre-existing ideas that they might have, which might be flawed. And the question is, well, this is perhaps one of the greatest responsibility for DeSci, and one of the greatest hopes we have is, can we create a system that addresses some of these pressing problems about the quality of our information spheres right now? And one of these ideas that could be very powerful is this notion of open verifiability. Open verifiability is the idea that anyone can take a research object, a piece of public research that is accompanied by artifacts, and essentially add a validation grant. And by adding that validation grant that would be earmarked to a scientific society with a certain reputation level, it would then start producing the validation work, right? It would essentially be curating our epistemic commons at a high level and caring for things such as reproducibility. And simply today, this absolutely does not exist. Verification is done at the behest of scientists who submit their work to journals. So I want to talk about a broader vision for DeSci and what are the components that need to be in place so that we can create this, this ideal of open verifiability. First of all, we need different models of storing and archiving research papers and research artifacts. We need to move away from silos that are controlled by publishers or by an operating company that are essentially closed off repositories which might have access rules into a model where we have gateways, right? Gateways that are essentially cylinders where you can create a research object that gets indexed on a universal record that is immutably open access. And our goal with the DeSci infrastructure that we're building is how can we create a maximally robust, secure, and fair principles, fair knowledge graphs. The second thing, and this is very important, if DeSci is to gain scientific legitimacy in the scientific sphere, we need to come up with a better version of record. The version of record is essentially right now defined as the published PDF. All right, that's the version of record. We need to move the version of record away from a simple manuscript that stands on its own towards a research objects would contain artifacts tied to that research, for example, data, for example, code, for example, a reproducible container, or even like a results presentation. All of those objects need to be in the same place, aggregated in a decentralized repository, which cannot be closed off and put behind paywalls. And we need to increase the certification scope. Right now, we're verifying manuscripts. We're not looking beyond manuscripts. We need to do peer review, conduct peer review, and conduct expert, high-level scientific validation on the entire object. We have to check if it's reproducible. We have to essentially verify its properties. And that's what we call attributes. We're going to get back to that. And verifiability today is closed, right? It's done at the behest of authors. I'm an author, I have a manuscript, I send it to Nature, and they'll come back with peer reviews, which are often closed. And I'm the only one essentially who has a lever on the graph of knowledge where I can elicit expert feedback, right? The other part of that is, of course, post-publication peer review, but there's no way to incentivize high quality post-publication peer review right now. And so this idea cannot work if we do not have a different model of value capture. And value capture right now is essentially entirely captured by the scientific publishers. As I do work as an editor or as a peer reviewer, as part of a journal, I'm doing that on a pro bono basis, right? All the revenue that is generated from selling the work that goes into these journals or through APC's author publishing cost, because as an author, you have to pay to publish. That's the model for open access. All of that value goes directly into the coffers of the publishers, and scientists don't see any of it. And that's an incredibly unfair status quo. And the deal would go something like that. It's like, well, we could actually do high quality scientific validation. We could check for reproducibility. We could go in depth. We could do a much better job. But that's not going to happen in the current model in which I feel like a content creator for Elsevier, and that's fair. So I want to go zoom out a bit and take a bit more of an academic mantle here. What does it mean to be published? So we have all these anachronistic terms when we talk about scientific curation, right? We say we have preprints to understand it's not published, it's not peer reviewed. A published paper has a number of properties, right? So a published paper has a set of attributes which have been verified by a trusted intermediary. And that's the certification function. One of them is it sound? Are the conclusions warranted given the results and the methods conveyed? The other one is impact predictions, right? And this is, the much maligned, is it novel enough for Nature, right? And are the conclusions important? So essentially you have an editor and peer reviewers and maybe an editorial board. They're all working to try to make a prediction if that particular piece of object that has been decided as valid by peer reviewers has essentially a conclusion of a scope that is of broad interest enough to be featured in some of these top journals, which are essentially have a monopoly on scientific prestige and guide decisions of funders and massive grant allocations. And there's, of course, the big elephant in the room, right? Nobody checks for reproducibility. Are the results reproducible with the artifacts provided? And there's one exception to this rule, and I think this is something people don't know. It's the American Economic Association, with its flagship journal, the American Economic Review, has an incredibly rigorous peer review system in which after it has conducted peer review for soundness, for impact prediction, it then verifies for reproducibility. And that's, that's not something that a lot of people know. And when you look at the academics taxonomy of journals, you have journals that only verify for soundness, like PLOS. You have journals like, the Science Nature Cell. They'll verify, they'll essentially certify for soundness and impact and make a prediction on impact. And the American Economic Association, on top of all of this, will verify for reproducibility by asking authors, to send their code and their data and have a number of scientists working with them verifying that the results reproduce. So that's a level of rigor that goes far beyond what we have in the classic sphere of journals. And one of the reasons why the American Economic Association does that, and not, let's say, an Elsevier journal, is that the scientific society has retained its publishing arm and has therefore been investing in improving at a cost, right? Things that go beyond the PDF, because there's only a business model for the PDF. And of course, there are organizations outside the scope that have been doing badging systems, right? And these badging systems have been designed to essentially provide alternative markers of quality, right? You can think of those as alternative attributes. So for example, has the study been pre-registered? You have this is from the Center of Open Science, who have been pioneers, by the way, in creating these badging systems. It has been followed by the ACM, that's the Association for Computing Machinery. They have done badges, have you shared your artifacts? Are your artifacts reproducible? So when you think about it, journals essentially convey attributes to pieces of published research. Now, can we unbundle the implicit and make it explicit? And I think that's one of the promising thing about DeSci, an alternative publishing system, is that yes, we can do that. We can essentially treat a research object as having a set of attributes that are verifiable and that are clearly indexed in a way which are tamper-proof on a decentralized ledger. So the idea is that we unbundle these attributes. The authors can self-select them, right? And then you have research communities that verify them. Anyone can contest the presence of these attributes, add these validation grants, and essentially elicit this high-quality scientific validation on these attributes. And you have things, that go from the work is simply compliant, right? This means, authors' identities have been verified, no plagiarism, all the really basic checks. But then you can have things, is the data being shared? Yes, it's open data. If the data has restrained access, is there a path where I can actually know how to access that data, which is very often something that's completely missing from studies that use sensitive data? Are the results reproducible, right? Can I run an executable container, or can I run the code locally with the data set and reproduce those results? Has it been peer reviewed? All of those core functions that have been previously bundled in journals in a way that has, extracted value from scientists can be decoupled and unbundled to create these rich research objects which have a plurality of attributes. Now, of course, you might say, well, there's never going to be an attribute system to rule them all. And that's absolutely true. And that's why it's important that organization, maybe ResearchHub, SCIRF, others out there can issue their own attributes, right? So you'd go defining your attribute, you'd maintain it, you'd set permissions on who can actually verify it. We can create plural systems of attribute verification, which would allow us to improve the reproducibility and the trust placed into scientific results. Of course, to do this efficiently, we need a way to aggregate all of the research outputs. So we need a way to essentially combine a preprint repository with a generalist repositories where we can take all of those components, like you see on the side, and essentially connect the front end of the paper with the back end, which are all of these artifacts that are stored on these decentralized repositories. And by doing that, by creating that interface where you can see and verify all of this, we essentially facilitate a system for attribute verification, which can be crucial and important in how, in essentially improving our epistemic comments and our ability to appraise scientific knowledge. And this could lead, to things like proof of reproducibility, which are incredibly valuable to funders. Right now, funders, they have no way of verifying whether a scientist that I fund with millions of dollars every year actually publishes reproducible research. There's no index tracking that. And that's one of the things where DeSci can add tremendous value in that workflow. So let me, I'm going to shift to a little demo. All right, so you've seen that at ETH Amsterdam. We're now in alpha. So we're testing the interface. We're going to be starting indexing to index on chain pretty soon on testnet. So the idea here is you can take any PDF, right? You can take any PDF, you can submit it to DeSci, you can start creating a research object. And once you've created the research object, there will be an embedding, right? Which is what you see up there, which is essentially an immutable link to the node ID, so to the identifier of that research object, which is clickable and resolvable. And once you're into that interface, you can now directly interact with all of the components of that research object. So here it's a paper on snarks. You can, for example, very relevant to these types of papers is posting artifacts such as code, right? So you can start adding codes directly into your paper. You can add, result presentation deck. You can add a video. You can do all sorts of aggregation to create a reproducible artifacts. And you can connect all of this together in a way that's very easy for scientists to use, because we're strongly of the belief that this needs to be a 20-minute process. People need to have excellent UI for all of this. This is the only way we're going to gain adoption. And essentially, you can drag and drop code files. You can indicate where people can actually find the relevant raw materials to recreate the results that are presented inside here, right? You can annotate it freely. And what I want to draw your attention to today is this idea of attributes, right? This open verifiability. So here, for example, we have attributes from the ACM, things like, are the artifacts available, right? And what is the status on this attribute that has been self-selected by author? Has it been verified? In this case, yes. And these attributes need to have a number of components to essentially verify that their conditions are met. We need to have a known issuer. There needs to be a versioning that's done on behalf of the issuer. There needs to be information about who's the certifying entity of that attribute. There needs to be proof that this attribute is warranted, right, in some way. And by doing this aggregation model on these DeSci nodes, where you can combine all of these objects, we can essentially create a system where it is legible and simple. Well, simple, it's still a lot of work, but it is possible to validate these attributes and to improve our epistemic commons and to improve the ability to create reproducible science. You can add validation grants. The idea is, for example, you'd say, hey, I want to verify attributes. I would pick an arc. This is, of course, just demo. But essentially, the idea is that anyone can be able to mint those validation grants to have them picked or not, right? Because these are grants by scientific societies that would then be producing the certification process, which journals have been doing up to now. And the system is complementary to the existing system. I think that's very important to stress, is that, well, we can still have the journal system, doing curation, and then we can have scientific societies that might be wanting to do reproducibility analysis, right? You might have scientific societies that do the whole thing. So this is a place where people and communities can start to experiment with the scope of the type of work that they engage in. So essentially, we don't want to have a silo. We don't want to be, hey, you have to go on DeSci.com/DeSci node to use this platform. That's not the ethos of Web3. That's not the ethos of a decentralized system. That's why we're creating an open source stack where every community can run their own gateway, right? Every community can set up a DeSci gateway, which is a deployable kit, which allows scientists and members of their community to create these research objects and to index them on a DeSci registry. Now, our goal is to create the most durable, verifiable, and fair knowledge graph possible, right? So that means we're mostly tech agnostic. But we are using the existing tech stack that we're displaying here. So essentially, we're creating the research object on a cloud interface. Then we use a IPLD to store that data model in a JSON LD compliant fashion. And we store that on the IPFS network through the work of those gateways, those community gateways, and we take the root hash of that using Optimism. We index it on a DeSci registry, which is an Ethereum smart contract, which essentially provides tamper-proofness regarding that specific object. And more importantly, it provides immutable PID, persistent identifiers. Now, everything in a DeSci node can be cited. Every component of it has a persistent identifier that can be copied and cited anywhere. And it's not at risk of link rot. It's cryptographically secured. But of course, the most important thing for all of this, regardless of the infrastructure we're building, regardless of these building blocks, is communities. And that's why we need to have legit and high quality scientific communities ready to take the risk of working and essentially, flying from their own wings and having that experience of recapturing the value that they create by curating science. And this is, there's a lot of concepts floating around that. We're thinking about how can we make these communities inspiring? How can we facilitate the community coordination that is involved around verifying these research objects? And this community layer, we're not there yet, but we're working on it. And it's something that's going to be very important for essentially curating these objects. And we can imagine these communities as collecting and curating a collection of featured work, right? These are the nodes of the research objects that the community feels most proud of, that means the most to them, and that exemplifies the type of work that they are capable of. And we're super excited for this futures. Right now, there's many terms. There's ARCs, autonomous research communities, DRC, decentralized research centers, research hubs. And I think, one of the very exciting concepts that has been appearing in past months is the concept of DeSci, decentralized society, which is a blueprint on how we can scale and we can create these communities that essentially create these plural network goods while tracking reputation and identities of their members. And science is a perfect experimental ground for that, because scientists need to show to the world what they're capable of. And we need to enable that in a way that is better than what has been done before. And so these are really some of our dreams and aspirations for the future of DeSci. And thank you for your attention. Alpha is live. We're testing on nodes.desci.com. Thank you to my wonderful team who has been growing, and it's just been a blast working with everybody. So yeah, we're happy to take questions.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. That was a great presentation, really exciting vision. Excited to see where your alpha goes. So we have a couple questions here in the next 3 minutes from Shadi, and I'll break them down into 3 parts. First one is, what are your expectations for how status quo entrenched industry players will respond to DeSci?
So it depends, right? Their shareholders might react negatively, but the people making the decisions and the people that actually are mission driven, they will react positively because they know they have a problem. The APC model charging $10,000 for a scientist to have the privilege to publish his work, they know it's not sustainable. That's a conversation we've been having, and there's that definite feeling that the system as it stands cannot continue, and they're desperately looking for different models. And if we can create a system that complements, right, it doesn't need to compete, it can complement the existing industry by adding value in terms of reproducibility, this is how we gain legitimacy in the scientific sphere, right? This is how we show our value, the value of DeSci, that we're not just about buzzwords and Web3. No, we're actually about creating a better, more reproducible scientific record. And here's proof of that.
Awesome, thank you. Next question is, what does the attack surface look like for a DeSci protocol?
Okay, so the big problem is identity spoofing, right? So, and this is also not just a problem that's specific to DeSci, right? You can also have identity spoofing on Archive. You can also have identity spoofing, on ORCID. There is a problem with identity spoofing, right? And we need ways to essentially to create a gradient of trust around the scientists that post their work to verify their identities and to essentially have some measure of confidence that they are who they say they are, right? And this, we're super excited working with Shadi and his team with Holonym. There's many interesting things in the space of identity that are burgeoning up. And this has been just accelerating since the DeSci paper, right, which has been a catalyst for all of that. And we're super excited to see, the type of solutions that come up. But essentially, the problem of identity spoofing is a very important problem.
And then finally, how do we engineer resilient protocols that survive long enough to uplift the publishing industry through transformational change? And then he also said, sorry for having such hard questions, but you're doing a great job answering them.
I love those questions. Yeah, open source, decentralized, community gateways, right? We are building a protocol that does not depend on the continued operation of DeSci Labs, right? And I think that's fundamental. As a scientist, that's the only reason, that's a prerequisite for me to use it. Right, I want essentially to have the ability to put my work on a peer-to-peer system, where these multiple DeSci gateways reinforce each other, creating network effect for each others, and start writing on this DeSci registry, and start accumulating and creating a graph of knowledge that is reproducible, that has fair metadata, that has all these other properties in a way that nobody can shut down access to. Right? There's no paywalls that can be put in front of it, right? The system is built in to be designed such that Elsevier cannot buy it out and shut it down, right? It has to be slippery, right? Just like BitTorrent, except it needs to, of course, be very legal to use, right? So I think that's very important. We need to remain within the precise confines of the law. We have to do everything by the books there. And we need to essentially empower communities with base layers that they can use and operate in an open source fashion.
Awesome, thank you. And Chris, if you're okay with it, it sounds like we have a couple more questions. If you want to hang around for another 5 minutes or so.
Sure, more than happy.
Cool.
So I wanted to ask you a couple of questions since you touched on reproducibility. This is something I really care about, and I just recently wrote a piece on ResearchHub on how to potentially make this better. A question I have is, do you think is there a way to kind of decentralize the work of verifying reproducibility for a study, decentralizing that in a way that we can kind of create a decentralized consensus on scientific claims? So we have different kind of research groups trying to replicate a study and see who fails, who does not fail, because we also have to take into account human error. That's something that might happen. So
there's really two different things here. There's reproducibility and replicability, right? So for those that don't know, reproducibility, can I recreate the study's result given the available artifacts? Whereas replicability is, I use new artifacts, new code, I collect new data, and can I come back to the results, right? So these are two different things. They have their own associated challenges, right? Which are very, very important. And this is by the way, this is the problem in science from our point of view. It's the lack of reproducible and replicability. And if you talk to scientists out there, they'll say, yes, that's the problem. The way we can do that, we think, is that we have to emulate structures that have been functioning. For example, the ACM SIGINT conferences have been verifying ACM badges. The American Economic Association has been verifying reproducibility of research. They have a culture and they have processes in place to do this. We have to learn from them, and we have to then create a knowledge base that we can essentially couple with these ARCs, these autonomous research kits, right, that can be deployed by these communities so that they can effectively conduct replication evaluation, right? And that requires, of course, a lot of learning. There's a lot of community leadership that needs to be done. But the fundamental thing here is that it's now the scientific societies that recapture the value, right? It doesn't go to the publisher. So all of a sudden, your research community can create fellowships, right, for its PhD students. They don't need to live under the poverty line anymore. Could be, just a $500 a month. That would go a long way in improving the situation of a student. And as a PI or as a senior scientist, I would feel a responsibility, to help my guys out. And you can now do that. We could orchestrate. We can create community coordination structures that allow for that specific goal of certifying reproducibility while returning value to scientists, which can be reinjected in the accounts of people that need it the most, the early career researchers.
Yeah, thank you. That was really a great explanation. Actually, also getting into the difference that is really important between reproducibility and replicability. So we actually have another one from the audience. What are your thoughts about reproducibility and immutability with the fact that many raw data sets and metadata, specifically in social media and healthcare, are personal information and protected by right to be erased? Thank you. And that's
I mean, great question, right? So there's different ways to address that. One of the thing is we want to make clear, do not put restrained access data on DeSci right now, right? That is not something that is appropriate. The reason is there's all sorts of regulation that essentially gate the rights to especially human data, right? Which is very, very sensitive. And we have to be extremely mindful of the sensitivity of that type of data. However, you can create a component which is called a restrained data access notice, right? And that component is essentially a metadata set, which tells the reader where he can find the restrained access data, how he can access it, what are the conditions of access, and that is preserved immutably. Now that has a lot of value because this is something right now that is lacking. There's very little clarity in accessing in the conditions of access to restrained access data. And what does that mean? Now, if you create a system in science where every study is expected to be reproducible, do we just say, okay, we give these guys, a free pass? They don't need to have reproducible results because their data is restrained access. We can't do it. No, right? That doesn't work. That's a monumental problem. And that's why it's important to know who has the right to access it. So that's communities that do the scientific verification services, they can actually have members that might have access to that data, right? That would do it within the trusted bounds of their institutions. And so that's essential.